Okay, this next broadcast or YouTube presentation and concerns the one possible way of solving the enormous problems that face our country today. And I've given this title of Revoke Washington's Power, Restore the Constitution. America is in trouble politically and financially. We have strayed far away from the original ideas of our founders. We are no longer independent states united for common protection and economic advantage. We now have 50 states dependent on a mighty federal government for a lot more than mutual defense from foreign enemies or for refereeing our interstate commerce. This dependence comes at an enormous price. The abandonment of individual liberty and the loss of economic opportunities. As federal mandates and authority have grown beyond any limits imagined by the founders in the 18th century, we the citizens lose our ability to influence political events, practice our local customs and habits, and have a say in how we are governed. In effect, we have reached a situation in which instead of a distant monarch and his parliament deciding our fates, this is now done by bureaucrats in Washington, executing directives and legislating through regulation. Many people have noted the situation, which has become more desperate the longer it has continued. 42 years ago, Ronald Reagan was elected to rein in the federal government. He succeeded only in diminishing its rate of growth, so that now big government has grown so large that President Reagan's administrations appear inadequate when we are considering a national debt of nearly $30 trillion, which comes to $92,000 per person. While the Constitution was being debated and drafted, the framers realized that the federal government, which the states were creating, could at some time become so powerful that it would never allow any legislative amendment initiatives to reduce or limit its power. To counter such an accumulation of power, the framers decided to include the provision of Article 45 so that the states would have a method available to amend the Constitution independently of the federal government. In 2013, several people under the leadership of Michael Farris and Mark Meckler combined to create the Convention of States Project. Politicians such as Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn and South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint later joined the effort. At the same time, Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, was published, and constitutional scholars like Robert Nadelson brought attention to the above described desperate situation. The tool they reached for was in Article 5 of the Constitution, which was written as follows. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case, that is, both if the Congress initiates it and if the states do, in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Recognizing the significance of Article 5, they set out to bring about a call by Congress for a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution that would impose fiscal restraint on the federal government, limit its power and authority, and the terms of office for government officials and for members of Congress. To have such a convention called at least 34 state legislatures must adopt convention applications or resolutions, identical in scope. Since the inception of the Convention of States project to amend the Constitution, 17 states have adopted resolutions calling for a convention to consider the three above amendment topics. Some of the resolutions specifically prohibit any amendments on other topics than those named above and provide detailed instructions on how delegates to such a convention may be chosen and what actions they may take carrying out their mandates. The Constitution has been amended 27 times since it was originally ratified, and amendments were proposed by Congress. Although a convention for proposing amendments has not been held, there have been several attempts. Recently, an effort to convene an Article 5 convention to consider a balanced budget amendment has been the closest one to succeed. Since 1789, there have been hundreds of Article 5 convention applications, but 2/3 of the states have not yet applied for a convention on the same subject. There were two occasions on which conventions were close to being called. Early in the 20th century, seeing that the states were close to successfully applying for the Article 5 convention, Congress adopted the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, thus making it unnecessary to have the convention, providing for the direct election of U.S. senators. In the 1980s, there was an effort to have a convention to consider the above-mentioned balanced budget amendment. As Senator Tom Coburn describes in his book, Smashing D.C. Monopoly, a coalition of leftist and conservative political groups combined against the vast majority of voters and President Reagan to prevent the convening of a convention to consider the balanced budget amendment. They used specious arguments about a possible runaway convention to scare away supporters, especially in the Michigan legislature, the 33rd of 34 states needed to have a convention convened. Despite that failure, the balanced budget amendment effort to call for a convention has continued. One of the earliest calls for a convention to amend the Constitution using Article 5 was made by the Massachusetts legislature in 1789 in response to resolutions anonymously authored by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and passed by the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. After much political wrangling, the acts were allowed to expire in 1801. But the conflict over the adoption of the acts by Congress had succeeded in drawing the attention of many people to the possibility of challenging federal laws and settling disputes between the states and federal authority using the provision of Article 5 pertaining to convening a convention. Eventually, Madison came around to agree that the states might, by application to Congress, have obtained a convention for the same object, meaning the nullification. Madison became a fervent proponent of the Article 5 convention as a check on federal power, arguing that it was the best tool to interpose against federal abuse and not nullification, which had been identified mistakenly with him because of the earlier Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. After the War of 1812 ground to a stalemate, the New England states considered secession in their opposition to the war, which they considered the work of the Virginia dynasty of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. They even convened a convention in Hartford and issued a report to Congress with 7 recommended amendments. But since they had not adhered to the provision of Article 5 that 2/3 of the states had to ratify the resolution for a convention, their amendments had no legal basis and could not be considered for ratification. The Hartford Convention continued their efforts until the Peace Treaty of Ghent ended the war and made their quest irrelevant. The next conflict between the states' rights and federal authority came when South Carolina raised Jefferson's Kentucky and Virginia nullification resolution against a new slavery-related tariff law, which they considered unfair to the southern states. John C. Calhoun became one of the champions of this nullification doctrine, calling it interposition. Madison, who was now 79 years old, argued that an Article 5 convention was the proper forum to settle arguments between the states and an overreaching federal government. In a letter published in the North American Review, a literary journal, the author of many Federalist articles and Jefferson's chief spokesman and representative at the Constitutional Convention wrote the following: "Should the provisions of the Constitution be found not to secure the government and the rights of the states against usurpation and abuse on the part of the United States, the final resort within the purview of the Constitution lies in an amendment of the Constitution according to a process applicable by the states." With our advantage of historical hindsight, we can surmise how accurate Madison was in 1830, 30 years before the beginning of the Civil War, seeing that conflicts between federal and state authority could only be resolved peacefully by convening a convention to amend the Constitution. There were other attempts to prevent the Civil War using a convention. Unfortunately, the last one came after a number of southern states had already seceded from the Union. The lesson to be drawn from these pre-war attempts was best summarized by legal historian Robert Nadelson. He wrote, "No one can say definitively that a convention for proposing amendments could have averted the Civil War. Certainly, some of the most respected political leaders of the day, including Presidents Buchanan and Lincoln, and a number of U.S. senators, thought that it might. If their assessment was correct, then the events of the time show us that there can be far greater risks in failing to call a convention than calling one." After nearly 160 years, well past the horrors of the Civil War and the many structural and political changes that followed, we are faced with the same problem. How can the federal government's overwhelming power be limited? And how can the states regain the authority which had been originally intended for them in the Constitution? The lesson is a matter of existential significance as far as the country is concerned. The failure to prevent the Civil War and its enormous casualties and material sacrifices is a historical fact. The inability to prevent runaway federal spending, the consequences of which are now prompting frequent warnings by economists, may soon impact the country in ways even more devastating than war. Individuals who are not wealthy cannot do anything to avoid the consequences of economic malaise and malfeasance. The examples are multiplying in smaller countries like Greece, smaller countries, continues, yes, smaller countries like Greece, but economists have pointed out that the U.S., which has the largest economy in the world, is not immune from the devastating results of reckless spending. That the United States is not governed by a centrally directed dictatorship does not protect it from heading along the path of self-destruction. Especially not since we have using methods not acknowledged as constitutional by some scholars, succeeded in centralizing power so much that effectively we are no longer a republic made up of independent states. Having had the devastating experience of what can happen if differences between sections or factions in this country are not resolved peacefully, the above examples show that the peaceful way of resolving such differences is by calling a convention to amend the Constitution. Before that is done, however, it is crucial to reaffirm what the responsibilities and limitations of such a convention will be, especially since so much misinformation has been generated about Article 5. Opponents of calling a convention to amend the Constitution always raise the fearful specter of a rewrite of the Constitution, as if such a convention could somehow approximate the original one in 1787. They draw a false parallel between what that convention did, superseding the Articles of Confederation, and what may be done today. Their primary argument that the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 was not lawfully called and was illegal in terms of Article 13 in the Articles of Confederation is refuted in extensive detail by Michael Farris in his 2017 Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy article titled "Defying Conventional Wisdom, the Constitution was not the product of a runaway convention." He demonstrates how the Philadelphia Convention was called and how each of the state legislatures selected delegates and provided them with specific instructions concerning the extent of their mandates. He reviews the arguments of the Federalists and their anti-Federalist opponents and shows that a conscious effort was made to follow the legal requirements of the Articles of Confederation. He also demonstrates that the ratification process provided for the Constitution was also first approved by the state legislatures, and thus was legal in terms of the Articles of Confederation. The reasons for the misconceptions about the possibility of a runaway convention are based partly in a distortion of the events surrounding the original Philadelphia Convention, which drafted the Constitution, and the way in which that document was ratified. Legal scholars and historians who argue that the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 exceeded its authority and overturned the Articles of Confederation because of the radical designs of the Federalists, besides disregarding the legal facts raised by Michael Farris in his above-quoted article, draw a false parallel between the original 13 states united under the Articles of Confederation and the United States as it exists today. When the one-time colonies had gained their independence from Britain and formed a loose alliance bound by the Articles of Confederation, they were in the unusual position of independent states, just a second, having to act together in a world which had not encountered this type of government since the Roman Republic. Having political and economic relations with countries like France, England, and Holland, all of which were led by strong central authorities, they could not supply a consistent, united position without some government authority acting on their behalf. Besides their relations with other countries, their interstate legal and commercial relationships were more those of independent countries of the time. They needed some rational system of regulating these relationships to avoid economic and legal conflicts. Founders of the Republic like Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington, joined by Hamilton, Jay, and many others, saw the need for a stronger central authority based on clearly formulated principles for the independent states. The long period of drafting and eventually submitting the Constitution for ratification was filled by extended arguments on all sides. Madison's notes are one of the few documents which provide an idea of the complex discussions which took place in that hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. Following the drafting of the original Constitution, it was submitted to the states for ratification. The states held special conventions for the ratification of the Constitution as stipulated in Philadelphia Convention recommended procedures ratified by the 13 state legislatures. There was a period of extensive public debate in which the arguments in favor of the Constitution were contained in the Federalist Papers, originally intended to convince New York to ratify the Constitution. These included some of the most fundamental arguments favoring the Constitution by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, discussing the extent of authority provided to the President, to Congress, and to the states. There were counter-arguments written by others like George Clinton, McClellan Smith, Robert Yates, John Williams, and Patrick Henry in what came to be known as the Anti-Federalist Papers. Publication of these arguments preceded the ratification of the Constitution by the first 9 states. Then the last 4 states ratified the founding document by 1790. Many of the arguments of the Anti-Federalists, who represented a minority in every state as attested to by the eventual ratification of the Constitution, were picked up and used by subsequent opponents of state conventions and by legal scholars who used these to support their positions against a strict adherence to the original intent of the Constitution drafted at the Philadelphia Convention. Besides the critics' disregard of legal procedure followed by the representatives of the states involved in convening the Philadelphia Convention, and subsequently by each state assembly which supplied delegates provided with detailed instructions, the ultimate contradiction is in drawing a parallel between the 13 loosely allied states of the 18th century and the 50 states bound together under the original legal structure provided by the Constitution. Since that document was ratified by the 13 original states, 232 years have changed the circumstances of the United States. After upheavals like the Civil War and the world-changing events of the First and Second World Wars, we have almost 4 times as many states spanning the continent, including the islands of Hawaii and Puerto Rico. We also have a federal government with hard authority and power far exceeding anything that our 18th century predecessor could have envisaged. Our Constitution has been modified, besides by the first 10 Bill of Rights, by another 15 amendments, discounting the 18th and the 21st, which repealed it. There have been so many legal decisions based on and involving the Constitution that the original document is now burdened by thousands of interpretive pages, effectively extending the purview of the federal government. Even more importantly, the precedent of over 200 years of existence cannot be compared to the less than 10-year life of the Articles of Confederation. Considering the care and thoroughness of the first 13 states in adopting the Constitution, it is unlikely that so many more states with so much more legal precedent would be less circumspect in limited effort to amend the Constitution and limited. Right? Because of the limitations on the way proposed amendments are submitted to the states and the precedent of over 2 centuries of practice and tradition, a convention would not propose amendments to modify basic principles of the Constitution. In the unlikely case that it tried to do so, 38 states would not vote to ratify them. More importantly, as pointed out by Senator Tom Coburn at a committee hearing in Arkansas, the fact that the resolutions submitted by the states have to be clearly limited in scope. Any amendment proposed outside of these limits can be simply rejected by Congress without it being submitted for ratification by the states. For those who support convening a convention to amend the Constitution, the principal argument in its favor is the dire situation in which we find our country, both politically and financially. We do not believe that the U.S. Congress has the will to initiate the kinds of changes which are required. The main reason for this lack of will to change the course of the country is that Congress is itself one of the main creators of the problem we face. The excessive concentration of power in Washington has led the most well-meaning and honest representatives of the voters to be caught in the web of money and influence. To challenge this concentration of wealth and power, the people through their state representatives must initiate change. They must be the ones who start devolving the unconstitutional concentration of power back to the states and localities where individual voters have more influence on political outcomes. There are 50 state legislatures in this country, each responsible for the safety, health, and well-being of its citizens, and each must achieve this in a way acceptable to their voters. The imposition of a federal power to solve local problems has not succeeded. In fact, it has made them worse and has placed enormous burdens on the average citizen. Like all peaceful change involving the clash of views and interests, returning the Constitution to its original form and intent so that we can begin to break up the power concentrated in Washington, D.C., will be a legally lengthy process. It may have successes and failures, but hopefully the people will see the rationale behind the efforts to break the hold of a set of unelected bureaucrats on the country and maybe realize that the original intent of the exceptional people who established this most unusual form of government was not the creating of an unwieldy center of power, similar to in its effect to earlier powers out of touch with the needs and wants of the voters. That is it. Possibly further discussions will follow.